Since class has been canceled tomorrow and 6B, I won't see you. I wanted to go ahead and record this. So this shouldn't be too long. Really, we're just kind of looking at the challenges to the New Deal and FDR's second term. If you remember what I have on the board, what you should have down in your New Deal chart that comes from the lecture slides, number 4, that kind of goes into the different programs. And remember me talking about how you have, the first New Deal in the first 2 years of his first term, and then you have the second New Deal and what is kind of the second part of that first term. You have an election in 1936, and I mentioned that he had a lot of criticism going into the 1936 election. Well, to understand what that criticism was all about, you have to really look at not just the criticism from kind of the left extreme, the kind of socialistic extreme, which involves Huey Long and his Share the Wealth program, and Father Coughlin and his taxation, and Dr. Townsend and his national pension plan. But it also included criticism from the other side, from the conservative side. And in the midst of all of this, you have the Supreme Court declaring a couple of major pieces of legislation unconstitutional. And that's going to create a great deal of frustration. Remember that the NERA/NRA, the Blue Eagle, where the government set wages and prices and production in exchange for these kind of posters, that doesn't, that gets declared unconstitutional because you have this idea, that the government's not allowed to do that. And you've got the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, that essentially says that the government's going to pay farmers not to grow certain things, and that's going to be declared unconstitutional as well. Well, for FDR, those are two big, pretty important pieces of his legislation, and he was very concerned that this was going to dismantle the New Deal. This was going to dismantle the New Deal. And so, he's frustrated with that. You've got this criticism coming from the conservative wing that says that the whole reason why the Depression is lingering, why by 1935 or 1936 you don't see more employment, you don't see more jobs being created, is that the government should not be in the business of creating jobs, that that's the role of free enterprise, and that, that the deficit spending and all this kind of stuff has been a big mistake. And remember, of course, that the American people had demanded that kind of action going into the 1932 election. But FDR is kind of hearing these criticisms. And you cannot deny the fact that while you have some jobs being created, most of them are being created by the government, not by private businesses. And you have really what is a lot of low wages. You're having this kind of lingering economic malaise. And so this is going to create a great deal of frustration for FDR, and he's not really sure exactly how to approach this problem. So he'll, going into the 1936 election, FDR is facing criticism from both sides. Now, he will win the 1936 election in a landslide, primarily because of Eleanor. Remember, Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR was in a wheelchair. Eleanor did a lot of kind of his traveling, did a lot of kind of the reaching out to the American public. And she was very famous for kind of creating this Democratic coalition. And it's this broadening of the Democratic base, increasing the number of Democratic voters, that's going to, really bring FDR back into the White House. Now, the issue with this Democratic coalition is not going to extend as much to the congressional representatives, the senators, the House of Representatives. So the congressmen are going to face a little more accountability with their constituents back home. So everybody really supports FDR, but how they feel about their congressmen and what their congressmen support might vary a little bit, right? And it doesn't have to be entirely intellectually consistent to support FDR and yet say, well, I don't like this program because it doesn't benefit my area. And why did you, my congressman, vote for this? Okay. That's not how, people think, right? And so you have this Democratic coalition that, like I said, Eleanor is a big part of kind of reaching out to these different groups. It's going to include African Americans who switch from the party of Abraham Lincoln and switch from the Republican Party and start voting for the Democrats. The New Deal struggles to struggles to target unemployment for African Americans, but they're at least making some efforts. And so most African Americans really kind of believe in the efforts of FDR. You're going to see women, of course, voting for FDR, laborers, farmers, immigrants, progressives, intellectuals, you name it. He's going to have this huge base of support. And of course, part of this, FDR has what he calls his black cabinet, African-American leaders who kind of advise the president on issues that affect African-Americans. You've got Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member as Secretary of Labor. She's going to be a big part for why the Wagner Act kind of gets pushed through. So you're going to have lots of interest. Lots of interest in kind of, how can we help these particular groups during this whole kind of Great Depression? And this is kind of where we're going to be going into his second term in office. Now, the other thing that he's concerned with as we're moving into 1936, 1937, is FDR is pretty upset about this whole declaring the AAA and the NRA unconstitutional. So he proposes to change the structure of the Supreme Court. What we call, he really wants to restructure the Supreme Court. And in essence, what he's saying is he wants to say that for every justice that's at the age of 70 or older, he should be able to get a new nominee. In other words, we need to have a continuous stream of kind of quote unquote young blood coming into the Supreme Court so that the Supreme Court is aware of what the people are going through. Now, the dilemma with this, he uses the argument that, the Supreme Court should not be legislators. They should not question the authority of the legislative branch. Except if you think back to 8th grade, when you learned about Marbury v. Madison and judicial review, and we certainly talked very briefly this year in Unit 2 about Article 1, the executive branch, Article 2, the legislative branch, Article 3, the judicial branch, and the checks and balances and kind of how the different branches kind of check each other. Well, the judicial branch is meant to check the power of the executive and the legislative branch by saying, okay, this is unconstitutional. You have to go back to the drawing board. You either have to pass an amendment to the Constitution or you have to rewrite the law. You have to do something, right? That's what this judicial branch is supposed to do. But that's not what FDR sees happening. He sees that the judicial branch is basically try to thwart the will of the people. And so he says that, he wants to kind of take over, he wants to add a bunch of new justices. And to some extent, he's allowed to make this request of Congress because Article 3 says that all it says is that Congress can constitute the Supreme Court and other courts as it sees fit, and that the Supreme Court justices serve for life. Or as long as they're willing. And so FDR is not proposing to forcibly remove them. He's just saying, if they choose not to retire, I'm going to add another justice anyways. Kind of this, wink, wink, come on, you need to step out, right? And so this is going to be one of the things that he tries to kind of push through. Unfortunately for him, unfortunately for us, because I think there's no question, this is a kind of challenges this idea of checks and balances, that he asked the Congress to change the size of the Supreme Court. As the Constitution says, Congress is the one that makes this decision. And basically Congress says no. It splits the Democratic support for FDR. Really kind of Democrats do not unanimously support him. He'd kind of begun to lose some of those Democrats because of the Democratic coalition and African Americans. So you had some Southern Democrats who are white that, believed in segregation that were bothered by this. So this kind of solidifies this kind of rupture within the Democratic Party. So you have Democrats that are less likely to just automatically side with FDR. So going into 1937, you have FDR really kind of facing, not only was he dealing with a challenge from the Supreme Court, but in 1937, he's facing kind of the fallout from this court packing scheme. And this is going to kind of, between this and kind of the shift, the critique of the New Deal, these are going to be reasons why in 1937 and 1938, the New Deal starts to slow down. This cartoon right here shows the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, with FDR cracking the whip on the judicial branch. So this cartoon pops up every now and then as kind of a depiction of the Supreme Court battle. Another problem in 1937 is going to be that the economy begins to slow down again. It wasn't going very fast in the first place, but it is starting to slow down. And this is what we call the Roosevelt recession in the middle of the Great Depression. And what happens is that Roosevelt listens to those conservative critics that say, "Oh, you're spending too much money. It's not the government's job to create jobs. You need to let private enterprise do that." And so he cuts funding to the WPA and the PWA. And so they begin to not start as many construction projects, which means not as many people are being hired. And so that's going to remove some money from the economy. At the same time that you have Social Security taxes begin to be taken out of people's income, so they don't have as much money to spend. So in those two ways, less jobs and less money to spend, you have this contraction of the economy in the middle of a depression when they're trying to get the economy started up again. And so this kind of Roosevelt recession is going to cause him to kind of lose some goodwill. These are kind of the ideas about supply side economics, balanced budget, no deficit spending, business investment money trickles down to workers, this kind of thing, that the recession is the result of overdependence on government versus a deficit spending, which is the government should spend money in a recession, even if it has to run a deficit, because that jumpstarts the economy, and that balancing the budget at the wrong time, that he needed to continue the spending for the WPA and the PWA. So this conflict between supply side economics and low taxes to stimulate business growth and deficit spending, where, the government can spend as much as it wants to. Those two things are going to conflict with each other. And this is a conversation that we have even today. What's the way to stimulate economic growth? Is it to spend money on infrastructure and that kind of thing, or is it to create tax cuts? So you're going to have, by 1937-38, Roosevelt asked for about $4 billion for the PWA and the WPA in order to resolve this recession within a depression. And of course, famously says, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. The test for progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have too much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." And so you're going to see that this really kind of sums up the meaning of the New Deal, this idea of trying to help those who are less fortunate. And what this really points to is the overall legacy of the New Deal, that the New Deal is increased federal power in the economy, increased federal role in the economy. The government is kind of a broker, as an intermediary between states and companies and the federal government, between employees and employers. This idea of a safety net, that economic relief programs protect us from economic disaster. Things like Social Security are meant to come in, relief payments, those kind of things. If we get into a crisis, situation, nationally, that kind of thing. And then, of course, our question that lingers is, how much should the government be involved? I mean, what is this idea between supply side economics and deficit spending, and how do we balance those two issues? And so we still struggle with this, but understand that with the election of FDR in 1932, you had the American public saying, we want the government to be involved in our economy. And that is very much a profound difference from what we'd ever had before. You've seen it a little bit with the progressive era, but now you really see it. And so that's kind of been the big kind of idea in the second half of the 20th century, is that the government does have a role to play. Now, in the 21st century, we've been a little less certain about that. There's been a lot more debate about maybe we have too much government. But understand that really what's happening in the New Deal really kind of is a precursor to those same arguments. Now, by 1939, the New Deal is kind of taking a back seat to the concerns with Europe. Lots of concerns with the rise of Hitler and Stalinism and all this kind of stuff, this rise of totalitarian dictators. And so we're very concerned with that sort of thing by 1939. So the New Deal just kind of muddles along. What we'll see is that by 1941, especially not by 1940, 1941, kind of getting ready, kind of aiding Great Britain, starting a draft, those kinds of things will begin to really finally put an end to the Great Depression. So interestingly, while we've been talking about the New Deal, understand that the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. It does provide relief. It does create jobs. It does create a great deal of infrastructure. It does some good things, but it does not end the Great Depression. That's World War II. Now, one could argue that part of that is that in 1938, Congress had kind of lost its taste for the New Deal and had kind of backed off of it. But it could also be, that, by 1939, 1940, as they're getting ready to, as they're thinking about kind of international security and foreign policy, they start signing off on more checks than they were willing to do before. So really kind of the big ideas from this lecture have to do with the court packing scheme. You need to be familiar with that, the checks and balances system that goes on there. You need to be familiar with a little bit with the Roosevelt recession, just the idea that cutting programs at the same time that Social Security comes out causes the economy to kind of slow down again. And you want to understand the Democratic coalition, how FDR and Eleanor kind of build a new Democratic Party for the first time. And so, this is just kind of this last little bit in a nutshell, pretty straightforward. I will kind of do this on Thursday before the test just to make sure no one has any questions since our week has been kind of messed up. You do have an assignment that's pretty easy. This is the FDR political cartoons. Basically, what you're doing is you're looking at these and you're kind of making an assessment about what the cartoon is saying. This one shows Roosevelt kind of driving the engine of the United States economy. It says a nation's confidence on the side, really kind of indicating the faith that the country has put into FDR. You see it again, this analogy of the engine of the economy. A new engineer is taking over. That's going to be Roosevelt, him trying to move that bullheaded inaction, the Hoovers, the Republicans that aren't wanting to do anything. This one, it is a New Deal. This really speaks to like that first 100 days with all the different the bank holiday and that sort of thing. This idea that he starts off straight out of the gate when he takes office. He's ready to go. And so you have this idea that he has a full house and he's coming in ready to go. This one right here, What a Man. You have him pulling into port prosperity. Notice a lot of these cartoons show FDR, moving, being physically active when he's really in real life in a wheelchair. And you also see that one of these little ships, you have, the economy, you have farm relief, you have unemployment. One of these says beer. Remember that in 1933, we have the 21st Amendment, and the 21st Amendment will, make it legal to sell alcohol again. So you want to be sure that you kind of know that. This one, second term, you have FDR driving the sled, Congress pushing American people, where are we going now? And Congress saying, I don't know, he's in charge. Kind of basically that FDR's running the show. This one, again, kind of paying homage to the 1936 Olympics. FDR kind of taking the torch from himself, continuing on with this New Deal policy. This speaks to the court packing scheme, specifically about asking the judges to, kind of trying to replace them, if you will, once they get too old. It kind of speaks to one of his fireside chats where he kind of came in and said, these guys are old men and we need to get them out of, off the bench. And so that kind of speaks to this one. This is a cartoon that pops up on tests every now and then. Shows FDR as Samson. He's already knocked down the legislative branch because the legislative branch is going along with him, and now he's attacking the judicial branch. And you can see the implication is that it's destroying American democracy. This is about the qualifying test for the Supreme Court, and it's FDR asking, and everyone's saying yes. In other words, he wants a bunch of yes men in the Supreme Court with the Constitution in the trash bin. This one, especially in light of, as I was saying, kind of the rise of totalitarian dictators, this government reorganization with the New Deal, followed by Supreme Court revision, is going to lead to dictatorship, very kind of anti-FDR. This one shows FDR kind of putting his thumb on the judicial branch. This one is really more not really pro or anti-FDR, just kind of illustrates the rise in executive power, because the executive power are the biggest sales. The legislative branch and the judicial branch are a smaller set of sales. So clearly saying that the executive power has gotten much, much stronger under FDR. So this kind of runs through some of these concepts for you. Hopefully this will kind of help you as you do this cartoon assignment, and then help get you ready for the test. The Socrative is open, so please be sure you study, and that's it.